In a world where silence is expected from the oppressed, one man's stillness made the whole room tremble. This isn't just about a slap in a courtroom. It's about the wound beneath it. About power, pride, and what happens when justice dares to wear the wrong skin. If stories like this move you, stories that peel back the layers of truth and show what society tries to hide, make sure to subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we tell the ones that matter. The courtroom smelled like lemon cleaner and dust. A faint hum from the overhead lights added a low, nervous buzz to the air. Rows of wooden benches groaned as people shifted in their seats, waiting, whispering, some chewing gum like it was a way to swallow down their anxiety. Reporters sat in the back, camera tripods angled just so, notebooks open, ready. Everyone knew this hearing wasn't going to be just another day in courtroom 4B. Judge Samuel Washington sat on the bench in his black robe, hands folded calmly, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. Because he had. His silver-streaked hair was trimmed short, his posture upright, and the expression on his face didn't waver, serene, unreadable. He had the kind of presence that didn't need volume. When he spoke, the room leaned in. When he was silent, it leaned further. In front of him, the defendant sat flanked by his attorney's deputy police chief Marcus Blake, a man with the build of a linebacker and the jaw of a statue. He wore his uniform like armor, but today it felt like a costume he couldn't remove. His badge was polished, but his eyes were dull, flat, cold. He stared straight ahead, as if daring the world to accuse him again. To the left sat the victims' families. One mother clutched a rosary, so tight her knuckles turned bone white. A teenager in a hoodie looked down at his shoes, eyes puffed from nights of not sleeping. Behind them sat a veteran in a wheelchair, his service dog an aging German shepherd. With cloudy eyes rested at his feet, tail unmoving. Outside, it was just another Wednesday. Inside, justice felt like a loaded gun with the safety off. Judge Washington glanced at the paper in front of him, the official sentencing document. Months of testimonies, evidence, community outrage, and behind-the-scenes politics had led to this. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. In the case of the state versus Marcus Blake, he began, voice low and steady. This court finds the defendant guilty of misconduct in office, falsification of official records, and abuse of power. No gasps, no outbursts. Just a pause, heavy enough to press against everyone's lungs. However, due to procedural technicalities and prosecutorial agreements, the sentence is 18 months probation, suspended, no jail time. The silence that followed was worse than any outcry. It was the kind of silence that sinks, that suffocates. Blake didn't move, but in the back row, a soft sob cracked the air. The judge's gavel hit once, firm but not loud. This court is adjourned. He reached for his pen and signed the sentencing document. That should have been it, but Marcus Blake stood up. Not slowly, not cautiously. He rose like a man lifting himself off a battlefield, like he had something to prove. The courtroom guards didn't react at first. Why would they? He was one of them, still in uniform, still wearing the badge. Blake took 3 steps forward. His boots echoed in a way that felt off, like a ticking bomb with no timer. Then dashed the slap, open palm, swift, brutal. The sound cracked across the room like a firecracker. His hand struck Judge Washington across the face, snapping his head slightly. To the side, his glasses shifted, one lens fractured. A single line of broken glass etched across his left eye. "You don't deserve that bench," Blake snarled. "You don't deserve any of this." Gasps broke loose. A woman screamed. Reporters scrambled for their cameras. Blake was tackled immediately. brought to the ground by two bailiffs, shouting profanities, struggling, still convinced he was the victim. He made me the enemy. Me! The courtroom erupted into chaos. The teenager in the hoodie stood up, fists clenched. The mother dropped her rosary. The German shepherd barked once, an old, tired sound. The judge didn't move. He just sat there, still. His hand came up slowly and adjusted his cracked glasses. He looked down at the papers on his bench, then back at the room, now swirling in noise, anger, disbelief. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just watched. Watched Blake get dragged out of the room like a rabid animal. Watched the courtroom camera lying sideways on the floor, still recording. Watched as the quiet people, the ones who had come only to listen suddenly, stood, some in fury, some in awe. No one had ever struck a sitting judge in Newport County. Certainly not in open court. Certainly not this judge. Not Samuel Washington. The sheriff's department would later call it a moment of emotional overwhelm. The mayor's office refused to comment. The chief of police said only, "We're reviewing our personnel policies." But for the people watching, none of those statements mattered. What they saw wasn't a man losing control. What they saw was permission. Permission to say, "See? This is what they do when no one's looking. When they think they're untouchable." What they saw was a man in uniform reminding them that power, unchecked, always swings back. And yet Samuel didn't flinch. He refused to give the slap power. Instead, he stood up slowly, hands steady, walked to the hallway behind his bench, and disappeared into chambers. Outside the courthouse, reporters buzzed like hornets. They wanted a quote, a reaction, a statement, but Samuel didn't speak to the press that day. He didn't call for calm or demand justice. He didn't post a video or tweet a response. He simply went home, took off his robe, and sat in his chair by the window, sipping lukewarm tea while the city screamed on without him. The swelling on his face began to darken. But his eyes? They were clear. He reached for an old file, one covered in dust, years forgotten. And with quiet fingers, he opened it. The slap was supposed to be a moment, a spark of anger, a flash of heat, a headline for a day or two. But instead, it became something else. By noon the next morning, the footage was everywhere. Someone had uploaded a shaky courtroom video to social media within an hour. You could barely hear the gavel, but you could hear the slap. That sound had a weight to it, raw, ugly, personal. And it echoed louder than any words could. TV anchors played it on repeat, like it was a goal at the Super Bowl. Commentators debated whether it was justified outrage or disrespect for the system. Conservative outlets framed it as a stress response by a decorated officer. Liberal commentators called it a symptom of unchecked authority. But in the middle of all that noise, something else began to hum. The people were watching, and they weren't forgetting. In the East Side barbershop, the slap played on a loop over the front counter TV. 4 chairs deep, old men and teens alike sat silent, eyes fixed. One man shook his head and muttered, "They slapped all of us with that hand." Outside the courthouse, someone taped a sign to the steps. He hit the man who wouldn't stay in his place. It wasn't signed. But by sunset, copies of that sign showed up taped to mailboxes, power poles, and community centers. And still no word from the judge. No press conference. No emotional statement. No calls for justice. Just quiet. It drove the media crazy. "He has to say something," one news anchor snapped. "He's a public official. He owes us that much." But Samuel Washington didn't owe anyone a soundbite. Instead, he wrote, late at night, behind his closed office door. He drafted letter after letter. Not to newspapers, not to local news, but to people who might actually do something. He wrote to the Department of Justice. He wrote to civil rights organizations. He wrote to state officials, even the ones who'd never returned his calls before. And in those letters, he didn't just mention the slap. He talked about why the slap had been possible. He wrote of pressure behind the scenes, years of quietly documented misconduct, cases where evidence had gone missing, where poor people of color were overcharged, where veterans were booked for loitering instead of offered housing referrals. He told the story no one wanted to hear, that Marcus Blake wasn't an outlier. He was the system, working exactly as designed. 1 week passed. The mayor made a brief statement. "We are saddened by the incident involving Deputy Blake and Judge Washington. We urge calm while internal reviews are conducted." It was the kind of statement that says nothing by design. On the street, it didn't calm anything. In fact, it did the opposite. That same day, a group of high school students walked out of class at noon. They wore signs across their chests. Silence is not neutral. By the next afternoon, the students were joined by local veterans, clergy members, single mothers, and former inmates with files still stamped "dismissed without cause." They gathered on the courthouse lawn with cardboard signs and weary eyes. No chants, no megaphones, just presence. And in the middle of them stood a woman named Anita Lawrence, a civil rights attorney just shy of 30, with a sharp jawline and sharper memory. She'd once been the youngest law clerk on Judge Washington's bench. Now she carried a folder with a faded label. Eastbourne PD Closed Cases, 2012 to 2016. She was the only one Judge Washington had trusted with that file. That night, a news station aired an interview with her. "Why now?" the reporter asked. "Why speak up after so many years?" Anita stared directly into the camera. "Because now people are finally listening." She opened the folder slowly, revealing the tip of the iceberg. Arrest logs with missing timestamps. Dashcam footage that had been lost. Officer statements that contradicted bodycam audio. "They always told me these cases were too small to matter," she said. "But when you stack enough small injustices on top of each other, they crush a city." Then she added something else. Judge Washington didn't say much after that slap. But he didn't have to. Because when a man of dignity chooses silence, it echoes louder than any shout. 3 days later, someone printed her quote and plastered it across the courthouse wall, spray painted beneath it in bright red. Echoes of dignity. By now, the protest had grown into a vigil. People brought candles, old photos. A retired police dog named Baxter limped to the edge of the crowd, led by a woman in scrubs. She said nothing, just sat with the dog at her feet. No leash, no uniform, just presence. A young girl approached her with a marker and wrote on a scrap of cardboard. He stayed still so justice could move. Inside his home, Samuel sat at his small desk. His cheekbone was still bruised, yellowing now, tender in the cold, but he didn't touch it. He just stared at the letters he had received. In return, one was from the Department of Justice. They were reviewing the file and evaluating the merits of federal involvement. Another from the State Bar Association. They were concerned. Concern wouldn't be enough. But it was a start. Then came the most unexpected letter of all. Handwritten. No return address. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. "Dear Judge Washington, my dad said you didn't fight back when the man hit you. He said you looked like you were hurt, but still sat up straight. I think that's real power. I hope when I'm a grown-up, I can be like you. Sincerely, Tyler M., age 11. Samuel folded the letter and placed it in his top drawer. No award, no plaque had ever meant as much. That Sunday, the local paper ran a headline. The slap heard around the court, but the subheading said more. What happens when a system's silence is louder than its words? By now, The mayor was scrambling to save face. An emergency town hall was scheduled. A committee formed. A new PR officer hired. But in barbershops and buses, on front porches and food pantry lines, no one cared what the city said. They cared what Judge Washington hadn't said. And that silence had done something no speech could. It had turned the slap into a mirror, and everyone was starting to look. The file sat in a metal drawer that stuck every time he opened it. It was an old drawer in an older cabinet, tucked behind the coat rack in the corner of his chambers, mostly forgotten, partly ignored, but not by him. Never by him. Judge Samuel. Washington knew every inch of this office. He knew which floorboard creaked when you stepped toward the bookshelf, which vent hummed louder in winter, and which drawer held the one case he was never supposed to touch again. He reached for it slowly, like someone retrieving a photograph of someone they'd lost. There was hesitation in his fingertips. Not fear, but reverence. Because inside that folder wasn't just paper, it was memory. Weight. Evidence of things seen and unseen. The label, still faintly legible in blue ink, read, Eastbourne Police. Depth. Internal complaint files. Closed, diis essayed. No one had said to bury it, that no order had come down. No official mandate. But back in 2016, the message had been clear. Too complicated. Not enough evidence. This will divide the department. This isn't your fight, Judge. He'd left it alone. Not because he believed those words, but because back then, he still believed the system could correct itself. That quiet pressure inside the courthouse halls could make slow change. That waiting your turn was part of the job. But after the slap, there were no more excuses. The man who hit him had been in that file. Not once, not twice. 6 times. 6 complaints filed between 2012 and 2015 alleging excessive force, unlawful stops, verbal abuse. Every single one had disappeared quietly, signed off with a single word, unsubstantiated. He remembered one vividly. A veteran named Walter Briggs, arrested for loitering outside a convenience store at 2 a.m. Walter had been homeless. He had a service dog with him. The report had claimed aggressive behavior and refusal to move. The store had no security footage. The clerk said, "I didn't want trouble. I just called it in." Briggs died in a shelter 2 months. Later, Washington remembered that testimony like it was carved in stone. The veteran had trembled while speaking, but not out of fear, out of shame. "I served this country," he'd said. "Did 3 tours, but I guess I don't serve it no more." Samuel flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the names. Some he remembered, some he didn't. All of them had something in common. No family connections, no money, no legal team. People without platforms, without microphones. Easy to ignore. There were coffee stains on one document, a red ink smear on another. The whole file felt like a relic. But the pain inside, it was still alive. Each case had one name in common on the signature line. Deputy Marcus Blake. He was younger then. Ambitious. Smiling in his personnel photo. Teeth too perfect to be trustworthy. Back then, Blake had been the department's rising star. Always volunteered for press interviews. Got results. Wasn't afraid to get tough. Everyone said it like a compliment. Judge Washington leaned back in his chair. The bruise on his cheek had faded now, just a soft yellow hue beneath his left eye. But the mark inside him was darker, deeper. The slap had done something strange. It had made everything clearer. Not just about Blake, but about him. All those years of compromise, of silent calculations, of deciding which fights were worth having, and which ones to postpone. All those years telling himself, if I keep my seat, I can do more good later. But later had arrived. and it had arrived with an open hand. He took the file and slipped it into a plain brown envelope. Then he made a phone call. Anita Lawrence was exactly who he needed. She had been one of his brightest law clerks, passionate, unafraid to ask hard questions. Now she ran a small civil rights office downtown, underfunded, overworked, and relentless. The kind of lawyer who still typed her own motions at 3 a.m. and brought leftover soup to her interns. When she picked up the phone, there was a long pause after he said his name. Judge Washington? I have something you need to see, he said quietly. She didn't ask what. She just asked where and when. The next morning, they met in his chambers. She wore jeans, a faded black blazer, and a fierce look in her eyes. He handed her the envelope. Without a word, she opened it at the edge of his desk, flipping through the pages like someone peeling back a wound. Jesus, she whispered. After 10 minutes. She looked up. Do you realize what this is? He nodded once. Do you? She stared at him. This isn't just misconduct. This is pattern. This is cover-up. You realize we might be looking at grounds for a federal investigation? He nodded again. She leaned back. Why now? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the window. Because when he slapped me, he said finally, it wasn't about me. It was about what I represented. And if I keep sitting here pretending like I don't know what's in that file, then maybe he's right. Maybe I don't deserve this bench. She blinked, taken aback. Do you want me to leak it? She asked. Media first, or do I take it federal? You take it where it can't be buried, he said. She smiled, then tight and fierce. That I can do. Later that night, Anita sat in her office with a single lamp on and 3 pots of cold coffee nearby. She'd created a master copy of the file, backed it up twice, and drafted an official complaint addressed to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. It was 12 pages long, footnoted, clean, undeniable. She also made an informal packet for the press, because in her experience, government moved faster when the public was watching. But before she hit send, she paused. She thought about Samuel. About how long he'd carried this weight. And about how sometimes courage didn't look like shouting. It looked like handing over a file and finally letting go. The next morning, the DOJ received the report. So did 5 national journalists. So did 3 watchdog organizations. And before noon, the words systemic, pattern of abuse in Eastbourne PD were trending. And right at the center of it all, the name, Blake. But the first name trending wasn't his. It was Judge Samuel Washington. It started with a single man and a cardboard sign. He stood outside the Eastbourne County Courthouse, on the steps worn smooth by decades of lawyers, defendants, and broken promises. The man's coat was too thin for the wind. His boots were scuffed. His eyes were tired. But his hands held the sign steady. It read, a slap to one is a threat to all. People walked by. Some slowed. Some didn't. A few whispered, is that about the judge? He didn't say a word. He just stood there. By lunchtime, he wasn't alone. An older woman in nurse scrubs joined him. She brought coffee in a thermos and held her own sign. Dignity never strikes back. Then came a mother with 2 kids, their small hands wrapped in hers. They didn't have signs, just crayons. So they drew hearts and wrote, thank you, on the pavement in pink and blue chalk. By 3 p.m., local high schoolers began arriving. Some carried printed photos of Judge Washington taped to poster boards. Some held quotes from his previous rulings, like, justice must be blind to race, but never to suffering. By sundown, over 200 people stood at the courthouse steps. No leaders, no microphones, just presence. It wasn't a protest, not in the way people expected. There were no chants, no bullhorns, No chance of shame or tear it down. Just bodies, shoulder to shoulder sharing. The same quiet refusal to let this moment pass. Someone strung up lights between two lampposts. Another brought a speaker and played soft jazz. A man in a wheelchair handed out tea from a thermos labeled Vietnam 68. A young girl knelt on the concrete, brushing chalk dust off her jeans, drawing a pair of glasses cracked right down. The center, like the judges, she whispered, but still whole. The next morning, photos flooded social media. Hashtag March for Dignity. Hashtag He Stood Still So We Could Stand. Hashtag Slap of Truth. News anchors didn't know what to do with it. They were used to shouting, to sides, to drama. But there was no antagonist here. Just a community stepping out of the shadows. By the second day, the crowd had doubled. Students handed out flyers, printed with Judge Washington's most famous decisions. Local pastors offered open prayers. Not for vengeance, but for vision. Veterans held pictures of comrades who never made it back from war, or who did, only to return to poverty and suspicion. And at the center of it all, still silent, was Samuel Washington. He didn't take the podium. He didn't wave. He didn't hold a sign. He just stood among the people, hands folded in front of him, coat buttoned to the neck. His presence said enough. A woman approached him cautiously. She was in her 70s, with a soft, lined face and hair tied back with a ribbon. "My brother died in lockup in '97, she said. "They said it was a heart attack, but I know better. They never let me see his body. They just buried him, like garbage." He looked her in the eye and said, "What was his name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Clarence." He nodded. Slowly, "I'll remember that." That night, local media finally arrived in full force. One reporter from Channel 9 held a mic to Samuel's face. "Judge Washington, you've started something here. Are you leading this movement?" He looked her in the eye, calm as ever. "I didn't start anything," he said. "People were already tired. They just needed somewhere to put their truth." She pressed again. "Then why are you here?" He glanced around at the signs, the candles, the tired eyes holding on to something real. "I'm here because I was silent long enough," he said. An hour later, the video hit 1 million views. The comment sections lit up. "This man is a rock. Finally someone who doesn't perform, just lives it. He's not marching for attention. He's marching because it hurts." By the third day, Anita Lawrence showed up. She stood beside Samuel with a folder in hand, the one marked Federal Submission. Her statement to the press was brief and direct. "We filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, citing a pattern of racial profiling, abuse of force, and evidence tampering within the Eastbourne Police Department. We've also submitted supporting materials to 3 national civil rights watchdog groups and the state Attorney General's office. And if they try to bury this again, we won't be quiet this time." When she stepped down, a college student handed her a handmade sign. It simply read, "This time they listen." She held it above her head, and the crowd erupted still without shouting, just clapping. Long, thunderous clapping. And for the first time, Samuel smiled. That night, someone brought a projector and shone a massive image onto the courthouse wall. A photo of Samuel from the day of the slap, the crack in his glasses glowing like lightning. Below it, in bold white letters, "He took a hit so truth could hit back." On the 4th day, something changed. The police showed up. Not in riot gear, not in formation, but they came. Chief Nolan arrived first, hands in his pockets, face pale. He approached Samuel directly. "Judge, I didn't come to make a scene. I came to listen." Samuel nodded. Nolan looked down, as if the pavement was heavier than usual. "No, when Blake hit you, The worst part wasn't the slap. It was how many of us ... didn't say anything after. Samuel didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "There's still time to speak." But words without actions are just noise. The chief nodded, shame thick in his throat. "I'm opening every internal complaint file from the last 15 years, he said. "External review. Full transparency." Samuel raised one eyebrow. "And when they find the rot?" Nolan exhaled. "Then we rip it out, all of it." Later that day, someone in the crowd began humming a tune. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, just a slow, wordless melody. But soon, others picked it up. The melody filled the air like smoke from a fire. You couldn't see, but couldn't ignore. An old man with a saxophone joined in. Then a girl with a violin. And suddenly, Eastbourne had something it hadn't had in years. Harmony. As night fell, candles lit every inch of the sidewalk. A young boy knelt in front of the courthouse and wrote in chalk, "When a good man stands." Still, the rest of us remember how to move. He didn't sign it, but when Judge Washington passed by, he knelt down and added one word beneath it: "Together." By the end of the week, newspapers across the country carried the story. A march that didn't yell, a judge who stood still, and a city that moved, from slap to shift. How a quiet reckoning took hold, and yet, even as the headlines multiplied, Samuel refused every interview offer. "I'm not the story," he told Anita. "But you're the reason for it," she replied. He didn't answer. But the next day, he returned to the courthouse steps. Same coat. Same stillness. And when the little girl from the chalk drawings waved at him, he finally waved back. Not with a flourish. Just with a quiet hand. One open palm. The same kind of hand that had once been used to strike him. Now held up, not in defense, but in unity. It didn't begin with a raid. There were no dramatic arrests, no FBI windbreakers storming the precinct. That's what people expected from the movies. But in real life, systemic rot doesn't scream. It seeps. It began with a letter, a thin envelope, delivered to the Eastbourne Police Department on a quiet Monday morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper, marked with the seal of the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The wording was clinical, almost sterile. "This office is initiating a formal inquiry into the patterns and practices of the Eastbourne Police Department pursuant to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. It was the kind of letter that doesn't shout, but when it lands on a desk, everything freezes. Within hours, it leaked to the press. By nightfall, the world knew Eastbourne PD was under federal investigation. Inside the police station, a shift occurred. The usual banter between officers stopped. The break room became unusually quiet. Conversations that once included jokes or sports talk now ended in unfinished sentences. And the officers who used to walk with their chests puffed out. Some of them started looking over their shoulders. Especially the ones who had seen their names in that old file. Chief Nolan stood in his office, blinds half open, watching a patrol car pull into the parking lot. He rubbed his temples. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He'd served on this force for over 25 years, had worked beside good cops, had even believed he was one. But now, that belief was like cracked glass still holding together, but one sharp truth away from shattering. He sat down and picked up his phone. The number he dialed was personal. "Judge Washington," he said when the line picked up. It started. There was a pause. Then the calm, even voice of the judge replied, "Then let it start." The DOJ investigators arrived quietly. 2 days later, 3 of them, 2 women, 1 man all. Dressed in plain suits, no cameras, no grandstanding. They met first with Anita Lorens. In a back room of her cramped office. She laid out everything. The complaint, the supporting documentation, the reopened files she had combed through night after night. This isn't about one bad cop, she told them. It's about the machinery that protects him. One of the investigators, a woman named Talia Boone, nodded. We're not here for headlines. We're here for patterns. And they found them dot-like breadcrumbs leading through a haunted forest. Arrest records that clustered around certain neighborhoods, predominantly black and poor. Use of force incidents that mysteriously lacked body cam footage. Complaints filed by citizens that had been internally dismissed within 48 hours. Often without follow-up. They found an old email chain where an officer had joked about cleaning up the streets, Blake style. No one in the chain objected. They found a handwritten log dated, signed, and sealed showing that Walter Briggs, the homeless veteran, had been detained for loitering next to a shelter that had turned him away due to capacity. He'd been arrested by Marcus Blake. Talia closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on its edges. I want to meet the judge, she said. When she entered Judge Washington's chambers, she expected formality. What she got was a man sitting behind a worn desk, no robe, no fanfare, just a quiet presence that somehow filled the room. He rose, extended his hand. Ms. Boone, he said. I was hoping it would be you. She blinked. You know me? He nodded. Your work in Pittsburgh, the wrongful conviction audit in Atlanta. You're not here to tick boxes. You're here to find truth. She sat down slowly. We're going to find a lot of it, sir. I hope you do, he replied. Because people have been burying it here for a long, long time. Outside the courthouse, the community had not stopped marching. But now, their signs bore different messages. We believed him, now they do too. This is bigger than Blake. We want the system on trial. People who had never spoken. Up were stepping forward. A former dispatcher confessed anonymously to shredding an internal complaint on orders from above. A school security guard shared that she had seen young black students referred to officers for minor scuffles, while white students were sent to counseling. A retired officer mailed in a statement unsigned detailing how certain supervisors preferred hard arrests over problem-solving and had once used the term racial containment. In an internal briefing, each testimony became part of the puzzle, and the DOJ investigators were listening. Blake, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Lawyer issued a terse statement. Deputy Chief Blake denies all allegations beyond the incident in court. He looks forward to clearing his name. But no one was buying it, especially not the public defender's office, who reopened over 20 past cases that had involved Blake's arrests. One by one, the pieces began falling apart. A man imprisoned for resisting arrest without cause. A woman who lost custody after being charged with endangering a child for sleeping in her car. A teenager whose only crime had been walking home with a hoodie pulled too tight in the rain. All arrested by the same man. All filed under uncooperative behavior. All dismissed as routine enforcement. And in the middle of all this, Samuel Washington never gave a speech. He never called a press conference, but he attended every community meeting. He sat in the back rows, quietly listening as people stood up and shared their stories, some for the first time in their lives. I never thought anyone would care, one woman said, wiping tears. But then I saw the judge take that slap and not hit back. And I thought, if he can stay standing, maybe I can speak. At one meeting, a young man stood and said, I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to ask about the future. He looked directly at Samuel. What comes after this? What happens when the investigation ends? The room held its breath, and for the first time in weeks, the judge stood and spoke. I don't know everything. That comes next, he said. But I do know this truth is only the beginning. Change comes from what we do with it. He paused. "And I promise you this much. I'm not going back to silence. Not now, not ever again." The next morning, someone spray-painted his words across a boarded-up building downtown. "Truth is only the beginning." It became a mural within 48 hours. By Sunday, people were bringing flowers to its base. And the investigation? It didn't stop. It grew. The DOJ requested documents from 5 other departments across the county. Civil rights lawyers from other states began calling Anita to offer help. 2 city commissioners resigned after being named in leaked emails. And the phrase, Eastbourne model, started appearing in articles about justice reform. SLAP had started it, but it was a file that fueled it, and a man who refused to fight back the way they expected. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the question finally came. A journalist from The Atlantic, a man named Eli Cartwright, requested an interview with Judge Washington. Unlike the swarm of cameras and hungry reporters that had buzzed around Eastbourne, in recent weeks, Eli didn't ask for flash. He asked for time. 1 hour, 1 conversation. No gotcha questions. No breaking news gimmicks. Just truth. Samuel said yes. They met at a small, nondescript cafe downtown. No security detail, no handlers. Just 2 men at a table near the back, coffee cups between them, and a tape recorder placed gently on a napkin. After 10 minutes of warm-up questions about the investigation, the community marshes, the DOJ inquiry, leaned forward and asked the thing everyone had danced around. "Why didn't you react when he hit you?" He asked it plainly. No drama, no bait. Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stirred his coffee once, twice. Then he looked up. "Because if I had, people would have remembered the slap, not the system that made him feel entitled to give it." Eli blinked. Samuel continued, his voice low but steady. "I wasn't shocked that he hit me. Disappointed, yes, but not shocked. The shock would have been if someone had stopped him before he did it. You see, the world's been conditioned to flinch when someone gets hit. It gasps. It turns the cameras. But we don't flinch when someone gets denied housing. Or when a vet is arrested for being homeless. Or when a kid is expelled for being angry in the wrong skin. We only flinch at violence we can hear. But injustice? It's quieter. It learns how to whisper." He paused, then smiled faintly. "So, I stayed still. Because I knew. Someone had to show what stillness can do when it's not about fear, but about focus." The interview went viral. Not because Samuel raised his voice. He didn't. Not because he cried. He didn't. But because in a world addicted to retaliation, he had made restraint feel revolutionary. Over the next few days, clips from the interview appeared everywhere. Someone had to show what stillness can do. We only flinch at violence we can hear. Injustice learns how to whisper. Those lines were printed on T-shirts, spray-painted on walls, spoken at youth centers, churches, and classrooms, and, quietly, without a single act of force, Samuel Washington became something larger than himself. But not everyone understood. Some critics called him weak, cowardly. He should have hit back. One popular radio host said, "That would have sent a message. He just sat there and took it." A comment online read, "That's not justice. That's surrender." A conservative commentator tweeted, "A real man doesn't just sit there. He makes a point." That tweet got thousands of likes, but Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to, because by now, the world had begun to learn something else. There's a difference between taking a blow and becoming it. Back in Eastbourne, young men who once thought strength meant fists started reconsidering. One 15-year-old told his guidance counselor, "If Judge Washington can take that hit, can stay calm, maybe I don't need to fight every time someone looks at me wrong." In a juvenile detention center 2 towns over, a former gang member asked if he could write to the judge, The letter read, "I used to think respect was about fear, but you made me think maybe it's about self-control. That maybe, if you don't swing back, it means you know who you are, and you don't need to prove it." Even officers quietly, off the record, began speaking up. One sergeant confessed in a letter to his wife, which later circulated anonymously. "I've always told rookies not to let anyone disrespect the badge, but maybe we've been thinking about respect all wrong." That man kept his dignity and still held more power than any of us. And through it all, Samuel kept working. He returned to the bench for limited hearings. He lectured at a law school once a week. He still walked to the courthouse most mornings. No driver, no entourage, and everywhere he went, people watched him not with pity or awe, but with recognition. As if his silence had broken something inside of them too. Something hard. Something they hadn't realized they were carrying. Then came the moment that turned his stillness into a national statement. A high-profile civil rights conference invited him to speak. They were honoring figures who had advanced justice through courage. Anita Lawrence was scheduled to speak. So were Talia Boone from the DOJ, and several grassroots leaders. Samuel declined. "I appreciate the gesture," he said in an email, "but I am not a speaker. I am a reminder." But the organizers insisted, and finally, reluctantly, he agreed to attend, but only under one condition. "I'll speak," he wrote, "but I won't use a podium." The night of the event, the crowd packed the auditorium. Everyone expected a speech. Instead, when it was Samuel's turn, the lights dimmed, and he walked slowly to the center of the stage. No microphone. No script. He stood still for 10 full seconds silent. People shifted, coughed, fidget. Another 10 seconds. Still nothing. Whispers filled the room. Then he raised one hand, gently, and spoke. "What you're feeling right now is the discomfort of stillness. We live in a world that rewards the loudest voice, the quickest reply, the first punch. But what if I told you stillness isn't weakness?" He let the silence hang again. "What if I told you that staying still isn't about being passive, it's about being deliberate?" I stood still in that courtroom because I wanted you to see what they didn't teach us in law school or the academy. That dignity doesn't need to swing to be seen. That justice doesn't need to roar to be heard. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not return the slap. The room erupted in applause, but Samuel didn't smile. He just nodded once and walked off the stage. Clip aired the next night on CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News. But it wasn't the applause people remembered. It was the silence and what it revealed. The next morning, someone taped a sign to the Eastbourne courthouse doors. He stood still, and the world finally moved. Courtroom 3A wasn't built for this kind of moment. The ceiling tiles buzzed faintly under fluorescent light, and the wooden benches groaned under the weight of more people than fire code probably allowed. Some held their breath. Others just bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in long-held exhaustion. It had taken over a year to get to this day. A year of files reopened, depositions taken, stories that had once been buried, finally laid bare in ink and testimony. A year of headlines, of whisper campaigns, of public statements and private apologies. But now the world had come to sit still and wait for what it always claimed to want. Call on justice. Marcus Blake sat at the defense table wearing a gray suit that didn't quite fit right. Not his old uniform, not his badge. Just a civilian now, stripped of power but not, some said, of arrogance. His jaw was still clenched, the way it had been the day he slapped Judge Washington in that other courtroom. A lifetime ago, he had pleaded not guilty to the new charges: civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, conspiracy. The prosecution had built its case methodically, file by file, story by story. Victims took the stand. Officers testified, some with reluctance, some with trembling relief. When Walter Briggs' sister spoke, the room went silent. "I found my brother in a shelter after Blake arrested him," she said. "His ribs were bruised. He said nothing, just stared out the window for days. They said he died of exposure, but I think he died of being forgotten." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to dot at the front of the room. Judge Miriam Stone adjusted her glasses. She was known for being measured, fair, not flashy. A woman who once turned down a TV appearance because it felt like performance. Now she had the verdict in front of her, written and sealed by a federal jury after 2 days of deliberation. The room stood still. Even the cameras in the back allowed, by special order, didn't dare click. Blake sat forward slightly, waiting. Judge Stone looked up. "On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty." No gasp. Just the sound of someone quietly weeping in the back. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of tampering with evidence, guilty. And on the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, guilty." The courtroom didn't erupt. It inhaled a full, aching breath of something that had been held in for too long. And then came the sound not of cheering, but of shoulders shaking, of silent tears, of hands reaching for hands that once felt invisible. Blake didn't move. He didn't flinch. Didn't speak. The same man who had once thought his uniform made him untouchable was now just another defendant waiting to be sentenced. Stone leaned forward. Her voice didn't carry anger, but it did carry weight. "This court sentences you, Marcus Daniel Blake, to 9 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A pause. "And let the record show, this sentence is not just about what you did, but about the people whose pain was dismissed, whose stories were labeled unsubstantiated. You made a career out of silencing others. This court cannot undo that. But today, it will speak in full voice on their behalf." Still, no applause, because the moment wasn't about celebration. It was about acknowledgement. The kind that says, you weren't crazy. You weren't alone. And what happened to you mattered. At the back of the room, Samuel Washington sat quietly. He hadn't testified. He hadn't needed to. But now, as the sentence was read, he felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not stillness, not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of something finally, slowly setting right. He rose to leave quietly before the cameras could find him. But as he stepped into the hallway, he saw a line of people waiting not for the elevator, but for him. The first was a young woman with tight braids and watery eyes. "I used to think silence meant weakness," she said. "But you changed that." A man behind her nodded. "You taught us that dignity doesn't need volume." One by one, they touched his shoulder, shook his hand. Some just nodded, unable to speak. And Samuel? He didn't give a speech. He just met each gaze, steady and kind, and said the same 6 words. "I see you. I hear you." That afternoon, the news spread nationwide. Blake sentenced to 9 years. Landmark verdict in civil rights case. Former deputy convicted in systemic abuse scandal. Justice served, but at what cost? But one clip from a local station captured the real heart of the moment. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, mic in hand, asking people as they left, "What does this verdict mean to you?" A boy, no older than 10, tugged on his mother's coat and asked if he could answer. She nodded. The boy looked straight into the camera and said, "It means even when you get hit, you don't have to hit back to win." The reporter blinked, and for once had no follow-up question. That night, the streets of Eastbourne weren't loud. No parades. No fireworks. Just people walking home a little taller. A little more seen dot outside the mural of Judge Washington. One painted on the old bakery wall. Someone had added a new phrase in neat handwriting. We were invisible until he stood still. Anita Lawrence watched it from across the street. She had spent the past year filing motions, protecting whistleblowers, giving interviews she never wanted to give. But tonight, she didn't speak. She just watched the mural, watched the city exhale. She thought of the judge, of his silence, his bruised face, his refusal to make himself the story. He didn't fight to be right, she whispered to herself. He just stood so the truth could move. Meanwhile, inside a federal prison, 2 states away, Blake sat in a gray cell. No badge, no followers, no headlines, just silence. The same silence he used to enjoy when others were too afraid to speak. But now, that silence didn't feel like control, that it felt like consequence. And as for Judge Samuel Washington, he returned to the quiet life. Legal ethics to first-year law students at the local university. Wrote letters of recommendation for public defenders. Walked his neighborhood every morning, rain or shine. He never gave a memoir. Never sold the rights to his story. When asked why, he always said the same thing. Because the story isn't about me. It's about what happens next. The library wasn't grand. It didn't have domes or chandeliers or marble columns like those big city cathedrals of knowledge. But it had warmth. Sunlight streamed through wide, dusty windows. Children whispered between shelves. There was always someone typing softly in the corner. Always someone sleeping just long enough to be forgiven. It had been a courthouse once, in the early 1900s. Now it was where people came to read, to rest, to learn. And today, it had a new name. The Judge Samuel Washington Legal Resource Library. The plaque was simple. Bronze, no gold, no granite. Just letters etched into metal, and a short quote beneath. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to tell the truth, and wait long enough for the silence to listen. It was the only part of the ceremony Judge Washington had insisted on writing himself, but he wasn't there to read it. He declined to speak at the dedication. No podium. No cameras. Just a note handed to the librarian that morning, tucked inside a blue envelope. It said, "Thank you. I'm honored. But legacy is not something you witness. It's something you leave behind." S.W. Still. The crowd came anyway. Not because they expected a speech, but because they wanted to stand in the space he had helped build, not with bricks, but with stillness, with patience, with a kind of faith that rarely made the news. Across town, in a modest classroom at Eastbourne University, Judge Washington sat behind a wooden desk, watching a group of young law students pick apart a Supreme Court ruling. He wasn't wearing a robe, just a cardigan, corduroy pants, glasses with one lens that always seemed a little smudged. A student raised her hand. "Professor," she asked, "what if justice hadn't come?" Samuel leaned back in his chair. It wasn't the first time someone asked that, but it always landed. The same. He let the question sit there, stretching out like a long breath. Then he replied, "Then we build something that outlives the waiting." That night, walking home through streets that once pulsed with protest signs and candlelight vigils, he passed a mural painted on a once abandoned wall. It showed a black man sitting in a courtroom chair, head slightly turned. Face calm, one cracked lens over his left eye. But behind him, towering, faint, almost like smoke, was the outline of something greater. A courthouse transforming into a crowd, each person holding a story, each voice part of something collective. Beneath it, someone had written, "He sat still, so we could move." Inside his home, small, brick neat, Samuel poured himself tea. No sugar, just heat and silence. He walked past a shelf lined with books. Baldwin, King, Du Bois, Ginsberg, each spine worn. each one reminding him that words don't always make change. But they survive until the moment that does. He sat by the window, same chair, same view of the trees, swaying gently above the old sidewalk. And for the first time in months, he let himself close his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in peace. The next morning, Eastbourne was ordinary again. A boy chased a bus he was clearly too late for. A woman balanced groceries and coffee, and a screaming toddler without dropping anything. A man in a janitor's uniform picked up litter in front of City Hall, humming off key. But something was different now. People looked each other in the eye more. Nod between strangers lasted a little longer. And when a fight broke out on a city bus that afternoon, someone didn't just pull out a phone. They stepped in. In the weeks that followed, change came in steady, almost invisible waves. The city council passed a new ordinance that required all police complaints to be reviewed by an independent civilian. Board. The law school added a course called The Ethics of Silence and Strength. A formerly incarcerated woman named Denise opened a legal advocacy center across from the courthouse. The sign on her door read, "Speak even if your voice shakes." As F.O.R. Blake, he served his sentence in a medium-security prison in Pennsylvania. No visitors, no statements, no appeal. And perhaps that was fitting, because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't always wear a siren. Sometimes it arrives like a tide, quiet, unstoppable, and it pulls everything into the light. One rainy afternoon, a former journalist named Eli Cartwright returned to Eastbourne. He was writing a book, not about Blake, not about the DOJ, not even about the case. It was about dignity. He visited the library named after Samuel, took a picture of the plaque, sat at the reading desk near the window, and watched a teenage boy teaching his younger sister how to search the court archive database. Then he turned to the librarian. "Do you think you'll ever come back here?" he asked. The librarian smiled. He never left. And maybe she was right. Because the thing about people like Samuel Washington is they don't haunt places. They inhabit them, not in body, but in blueprint. Not in voice, but in volume, the kind that lingers when everyone else finally stops talking. A few months later, a freshman at Eastbourne High stood before her English class and read her essay aloud. The assignment was, "Write about someone who changed your mind." She began like this. "I used to think strength meant yelling loud enough to be heard. But then I learned about a man who got hit in front of the world and didn't hit back, who didn't scream, who didn't even raise his voice, and the world still listened." On the last page, she wrote, "That's the kind of strong I want to be. The kind that stands so still, truth finally has a place to land. The kind that makes room for the rest of us to move." Samuel never read that essay, but it didn't matter, because in some corner of the world, on a sidewalk, in a courtroom, in a classroom, or a quiet home, his stillness was still working, still teaching, still echoing, still moving justice forward, one silent truth at a time. Asterisk, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike back. He just stood still. S.O. Justice could move forward. And maybe that's the lesson, that sometimes the loudest courage is quiet. The deepest strength looks like dignity. And change starts with one person who refuses to be moved. If this story made you feel something, share it. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because the world needs more than entertainment. It needs remembrance. It needs truth. And it needs voices like yours, standing beside voices like his.